On the one hand, this book, Alice and Freda Forever, is about two Victorian-era American women in Memphis who were certainly in an intimate relationship. They planned to run away together, with Alice wanting to play the husband to Freda's wife. They wanted to build a life together, just the two of them. This wasn't chumming, as it was called at the time. It wasn't gals being pals. It was two women who wanted to be together, romantically. And on the other hand, we know all of this stuff about them because one of them murdered the other one and then died in an asylum. This is the reality of history of same-sex relationships prior to a certain period. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich is this amazing historian who coined the phrase, well-behaved women seldom make history, which has been adopted as a feminist rallying cry. But what Ulrich meant was that people who stick within general societal norms, your average everyday person in the past, is not going to make it into the historical record. We know about Alice and Freda. We know about the letters they sent each other, the rings they exchanged, the ways they talked about each other, because Alice murdered Freda. And that's what makes this book such an excellent choice for people who aren't sure they want to try a nonfiction history book. It not only gives you this true crime story that hooks you from the very beginning, it also explains why this historical story makes it into the records, and explains why we know this is not a story about two gals being pals. The context that the author, Alexis Coe, gives us about women's lives in 1890s America makes clear what that difference really is. My name's Joanna, I'm an historian, and this is a history book I think you'll love. Now, as I keep saying, what really sucks people into a history book is having a story to follow. I didn't label this true crime by accident. This book has all of the things that fascinate people about true crime. There is a terrible crime. There is a melodramatic court case that has a surprise in the middle of it. There's letters that were supposed to be destroyed that are entered into evidence, and a trial about whether or not being too mannish is a reason to be institutionalized for the rest of your life. I know I sound a bit flippant. This is a story about a horrible relationship that ends in murder. I don't want to pretend that it's somehow romantic because it's a relationship between two women. It was abusive. It ended in violence. But let me give you the highlights and then explain why I think you'll love this book. So Alice and Freda were two young women in post-Civil War era America that went to a fancy school together, which tells us that they were in the upper echelons of their society. Alice was a bit higher up in this echelon than Freda was. The goal of their lives was to find nice men to marry, settle down, and raise a family of equally nice white children in a segregated southern state. We don't know exactly how they came into a romantic relationship, but we do know that chumming, which was basically girls being extremely friendly with each other, was a common Victorian-era thing. Coe describes how proper American women weren't supposed to talk about desiring men, oh, the scandal, but instead have these romantic, intense friendships that were a way of rehearsing the great drama of women's lives, their relationships with men. If you, like me, grew up reading Anne of Green Gables and thought that the friendship between Anne and Diana was intense, that's what we're talking about here. There was nothing unusual about that friendship. That's what chumming was. Alice and Freda had friends named Jo and Lily who were also chumming. But there was something different about Alice and Freda. Sleepovers when visiting each other were normal, but Alice and Freda spent a lot of time scheming on how to make sure they would end up alone together in bed. They made active plans to run away together and get married. They exchanged rings and promises. Their relationship was intense enough that eventually their families intervened and they were forbidden from seeing each other anymore. Now, I want to be clear that Freda didn't do anything wrong here, but what happens is that she started to spend time with potential male suitors. Alice found out and decided the only way to move forward was to kill Freda and then kill herself and die dramatically next to her. This is not a great plan. So Alice didn't succeed in the killing herself portion of the story, and this is really the reason we know so much about this event. Alice surviving meant that not only was there a trial about the murder, but also her friend who had accompanied her to town the day she killed Freda was also on trial for whether or not she had aided and abetted the murder. Now you might be thinking, okay, these letters all come up and are read out loud and discussed in the court because they needed to go to motive or something. And you're kind of right. But the real reason the letters become important was because the jury, the judge, the lawyers, the doctors, the public, the newspapers, everybody needed to decide if Alice was insane. But not for killing Freda, and not even for thinking that she was in love with another woman, but for being too mannish and thinking that she and Freda could be married, a marriage in which there could be no children, not ever. That is part of the insanity, apparently. The idea that this could be a marriage without a man and without a child. I put the word lesbian in the thumbnail and title because I wanted your attention. I too want you to like and subscribe and tell your friends how great my videos are. But this isn't the right term. And part of why people get frustrated with historians who won't just say, lesbian, Rose, they're lesbians, there's a reason for that. And I think a good way of explaining that is from this thread I read on Bluesky by Dr. Alexiana Frey that I have linked below. She explains that a lot of times scholars want to use terms that are more appealing to a modern audience, quote, haphazardly. We use terms because, for lack of better terms, they are sexy and provocative and get people to feel something. This is unfortunate in many ways because we are using real people's lives and struggles in order to make our work more appealing, unquote. She's actually talking about something very different in her thread, but it still works well for thinking about why, as an historian, I shouldn't be applying the label lesbian to Alice or Freda. Neither of them would have recognized that term. Neither of them would have felt it applied to them if they did recognize it, and probably would have been offended if we went back in time and tried to explain it to them. They weren't lesbians. They were just in love and planned a future together. They knew that they would have to hide who they were to do that. They didn't think there were other women like them. Why would they? In this book, there are two different trials that happen. The one trying to decide if Alice's friend Lily was partly responsible for the murder, and the one about whether Alice is really responsible for it at all. A big part of it is the determination of whether Lily is a lying liar who lies, and if she is a lying liar, did she help plan the murder? Did you know that she wrote letters to boys? Did you know that she gave those boys a fake name? Did you know she flirted? How can you trust such a woman? If she lied about her name in a letter, what else is she lying about? Now, Coe uses these trials in a way that makes them more than just a true crime book, but a great introductory history text for someone who thinks, do I want to read more history? What makes something a history book rather than just a story about the past? I phrase this question to my students as, why are we taking a class on this instead of just reading a Wikipedia article every week? This is what we call reading against the sources. It's the behavior that Alice and Lily are exhibiting is considered abnormal enough that there's a whole court case about it. What does that tell us about the expectations placed on women of a certain class in the past? How do we understand those expectations? What about those expectations mean these cases suddenly be national news? What would a well-behaved woman who didn't make it into history be actually doing? Coe doesn't do this in a really heavy-handed way. When I'm trying to teach new historians, I get a bit vigorous about sources. What are the biases? Who wrote the source? What's the context? My poor students. Instead, what Coe does is point out how a lot of the reporting focuses on the inappropriate behavior of the women watching the trial. How dare women show up to a case like this? It's so inappropriate. What is their weird fascination with blood? It just sounds like 2025 all over again. She also describes the various medical experts that were brought in to prove that Alice was insane and that she got that insanity from her mother. I swear 90% of psychiatric history can be summed up as, is there a mother nearby? Can I blame her? She talks about the way that Alice and the women involved in the case were treated in part because they are nice, white, wealthy women, and there's an expectation of the delicacy of those women that isn't the same expectation of women of different classes and different races. At the same time as newspapers are arguing that gentle Alice shouldn't be hanged, she's a delicate flower who just went insane because she was too manly for this world. The same newspapers were calling for the public hanging of Ida B. Wells, a black woman who wrote about how lynching black men for allegedly having sex with white women was bad. Who gets the protection of being a delicate flower and who doesn't? And how do the lives of the delicate flowers in this history play out? Being a delicate flower didn't save Alice from dying alone in an asylum. It just meant people were sad about it. Now, a common thing that historians do is talk about the importance of gender, race, and class. We describe age as a useful category of analysis. We talk about constructions of disability. Coe is doing all of that, but she does it in a way that ties it so completely to the story of Alice and Freda that it doesn't feel like you're being lectured. It's such a great way of introducing someone to these forms of analysis. Now, another thing I really enjoy about this book is the way Coe uses her sources. I am a sources girl. A big thing that historians do is look at various sources and synthesize them in a way that considers multiple points of view and considers biases and audience. So when she talks about the wide variety of news sources, she explains that they each have a point of view that drives their sales. And sometimes they lie to do that. Sometimes they just make mistakes in their rush to get the news to print so they can be the first to report on something. She considers the motivation of both the defense and the prosecution and the families of both girls and the decisions made in the courtroom about how Alice behaves and what it is she does. She talks a lot about what's happening with medical understandings of depression, particularly postpartum depression, and the way that the doctors called into the trial make clear that there's something wrong with Alice. She's a tomboy. She excels at sports. She doesn't seem to have an interest in men. She gets nosebleeds regularly, which started when she began to menstruate, but she also goes to dances, and she dances with boys. Doesn't that mean she isn't insane? That's normal behavior. She needs to be held responsible for what she's done. She's not crazy. She's a murderer. The other thing about this book that I think will make it great if you're wanting to ease into academic history is that it's short. I'm sorry, I know I keep mentioning in these videos about length, and I know how intimidating it is to pick up something that's 700 pages of dense text about why Darwin changed the world, or what's important about sod huts in Canadian history, or gender, urban culture, and the making of the gay male world. This book is a breezy 200-ish pages, or only 5 hours if you prefer your history read to you. If you get this book, you're not committing to the next 6 months of reading about incredibly sexist judges and doctors who think liking baseball makes a woman a deviant who needs to be locked up. Another thing Coe does that I think makes this a great book is that she explains how this specific case ended up shaping attitudes towards intense female friendships and ultimately ends up pathologizing them. She talks about how medical journals wrote about Alice's action as a warning to parents, particularly mothers, about predatory lesbians, an attitude we see continuing well into the 20th century, 21st century, now. I'm a 19th century historian, and I do not like how much of what I study and understand keeps on being relevant. It's very exhausting. Alice and Freda Forever is a great book. It's not just a true crime story, although that makes it really engaging and easy to read, but it's also a discussion of all these things that make history history. It matters that Alice and Freda were both nice white ladies. It matters that these events happened in the 1890s. It matters that Alice's father acted appropriately masculine in having his wife committed and pushing for his daughter to be committed as well. And this book pulls that apart in a way that makes it easy to see and understand for someone who didn't spend 2 years reading 500 books about dead people. 2 years of my life that I will never get back. Anyway, I am really enjoying making these videos, and I appreciate how many of you seem to enjoy watching them. The next video is either going to be an overdue gift guide for potential new historians, or I'm going to talk about historically significant quilts. I haven't decided which. I did just get a book about wolves in Canadian history, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. And I can't wait to share these books with you. Until then, be good to yourselves, be good to each other, and tell your pets I said hi.